There we go. Recording in progress.
I can do that if you want.
No, no, it's okay. We've got the YouTube recording. I mean, I guess, I mean, it's just a button. You can push it if you want.
Yeah.
Um, so tonight we will be reading "Being for Self," and really only the opening of "Being for Self" up to um, the one, the one and the many. Sounds like a Lord of the Rings fanfic.
I tried Googling being for self and found mostly passages quoted from Science of Logic. So apparently, not too many people can explain it in their own words.
Well, the problem is that it depends on which page you're on. When are you talking about the immediate being for self that collapses, or the one that consists in the undifferentiatedness of being a moment? See, there's a difference,
Yeah.
and yeah. And I'm sitting here like, okay, I get it, but at the same time, I'm like, what? Why would you call it the same thing? Um, but I mean, he's trying to do the logical sequence. And lots of these terms have pull double duty depending on where in the process they are.
There
Um,
seems to be a lot of as such, and then when it becomes a fully
fully
explained.
realized, yeah,
Yeah.
it's like okay, so yeah, and so you wonder which one of those did Marx use to apply to the proletariat as being for self, as like a self-conscious entity, you know. You're hoping a fully realized being for self and not just the immediate one that collapses into a couple different sects, which each of which are being for one. That's a little Marxist. That's a little Trotskyist humor there. Oh, every one of them is a being for one. The ISO, the PSL, et cetera, et cetera. What a shitty situation. Okay. Oh, and Kasama. We wouldn't want to leave out Kasama, Doug.
Oh, you want to leave out they suck.
Okay. Well, I mean, each one had its own brand of suck. So which had to be negated eventually. Oh, sorry if man, my voice is going, so I don't know how long it's going to be able to go tonight. I'll try my best. So
That's
anyway,
fine.
like I said, we're starting off with being for self. I'm going to go ahead and read the summary page so that everyone kind of gets a flavor for what we're looking at. And then I'm going to talk about a couple other things, and then we'll go to discussion. Sound good?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So in being for self, qualitative being finds its consummation. It is infinite being. The being of the beginning lacks all determination. Determinate being is sublated, but only immediately sublated being. He's reviewing through the steps from the beginning. It thus contains, to begin with, only the first negation, which is itself immediate. It is true that being too is preserved in it, and both are united in determinate being in a simple unity, but for that very reason, they're not in themselves still unequal to each other, and their unity is not yet posited. Determinate being is therefore the sphere of difference, and this is key. Okay, so it's the sphere of difference, of dualism, the field of finitude, finiteness. Determinateness is determinateness as such, in which being is only relatively, but not absolutely determined, um, meaning it's related to an other by its nature, as opposed to being self-related, right? Which is the absolute determined. In being for self, the difference between being and determinateness or negation is posited and equalized. Okay. Quality, otherness, limit, like reality, being in itself, the ought, and so on, are the imperfect embodiments of the negation. in being, in which the difference of both still lies at its base. So all those that I just listed off are based on a difference between the moments in Dasein. Okay, then they're not. None of them are self-relating exactly. They're related to an other, so to speak, or another category. Let's see. Since, however, infinitude, the negation has passed into infinity, into the positive negation of negation, it is simple self-relation, and consequently in its own self, the equalization with being, absolutely determined being. I'm increasingly sounding like Megatron. Starscream! Being for self is first immediately a being for self, the one. Secondly, the one passes into a plurality of ones, repulsion, and this otherness of the ones is sublated in their ideality, attraction. Thirdly, we have the alternating determination of repulsion and attraction, in which they collapse into equilibrium and quality, which in being for self reaches its climax, passes over into quantity. Okay, so that's his summary page. And from here, he talks about being for self as such, the determinate being and being for self, being for one. He talks about a German expression which captures some of this right in the language. And then he goes on to the one. Now, okay, give me a second. What does all this mean? Well, it means quite a few different things, but I wanted to read out some stuff that I got from Hegel, which helps a little bit. So, all right. So we're at the point where we're going over from moments within Dasein that are united in their difference to moments in being for self that are self-relating. Okay, and that's a different animal. Being for self is determinate being that is infinitely self-relating, or as Hegel puts it, absolutely determinate being. Recall that determinate being or quality as such takes the form of something which is bound up with that of other things, subject to being changed by other things, right? But being for self is not subject to being changed by things necessarily. It's related to itself infinitely. Unfortunately, what it loses because it pushes over into being for self is its determinacy. It becomes more indeterminate in the beginning. It reduces the thing to an empty one, is what Hegel says. And I read some more of this. I'm just going to read this. So going back, Dasein relates to itself to form something, but at the same time, each of its two moments, reality and negation, relates to itself in the other in which it is concealed. The finite and bad infinite two come to unite with themselves via one another, right? Yielding true infinity is a process or becoming. Being for one, however, relates immediately and solely to itself. The moment to which it relates is not its other or negation, but is simply itself, being for one once again. The self-relation that is constituted by being for one is thus an immediate self-relation or pure being for self rather than an infinite process. So basically, we're going from where infinity and finiteness are a process like becoming, and being for self as truly consummated is a state of being. It's not a becoming, it's a being, just to relate it to the beginning of the book. Okay. If it sounds like it rhymes, it does. Okay, hang on. The self-relation that is constituted by being for one is thus an immediate self-relation. Yet it is not pure and simple immediacy, such as we saw at the beginning of the logic, but immediacy based on negating. More precisely, it is based on negating the difference between moments and negating the very form of being a moment at all. Unlike the first being for self, therefore, the new being for self, the consummated one that turns over into quantity, does not contain any moment or being for one within itself. And that's where I stopped before I had to turn on the camera. So I'm going to stop there. But that's a lot already. I'll leave Stack open and just type Stack if you want to talk, or just jump on. I mean, we're pretty informal. Thanks. But just remember where this is leading is quality being consummated and then transitioning to quantity.
Because it almost feels like it's kind of creating the infinite circle itself is the beginning of creating that membrane that becomes the divisible pieces that make it one set.
And then another one, and then another one,
Yeah.
and another one. And natural numbers come in with quantity. And then you can measure them, but we're not there yet.
I think that difference there is rationality at that point, as in numerical rationality is what makes measure different than from standard quantity.
Ah, yes.
That's the part I'm trying to kind of sit down and map out, because obviously the kind of oscillating back and forth between being and nothing makes perfect sense. But now we're at a point to where we kind of see the moment of the form of being we're looking at and relating to itself, and then we've kind of become out with a new determination based off of that is found to not be contained in the form of being as we have, and now we have to take that into account.
Yeah.
It's what seems to be the new general idea of what's happening I have so far.
So with this collapse of the difference between moments, the very form of being a moment also disappears. And I'm just reading the Hoolgate. A moment is just one side of a difference or relation. In relating to itself, however, being a moment or being for one ceases being just one side, and so ceases being what it is, and constitutes immediate being for self instead. In this respect, therefore, immediate being for self is based on negating, namely on negating, or rather on the self-negating of being a moment. Since the new being for self is constituted by the collapse of the difference, it is immediately itself with no internal moments. It does not, however, just lack such moments as does pure being, but it immediately consists explicitly in not having them. This is the case because it is immediate self-relation that just is the having disappeared of the moments. The new being for self is thus not indeterminate, but determinate immediacy, an immediacy whose determinacy resides explicitly in not having moments. It is important to stress that this being for self is determinate, not by virtue of having a determination and constitution, but specifically by virtue of not having what it lacks. Its determinacy thus introduces an explicit limit into it. Being for self, as it has now reemerged, is both defined and limited by the fact that it has no moments, yet is also purely self-relating determinacy with no other outside it. It has its defining limit, therefore, purely within itself and is not limited by anything else. Accordingly, Hegel writes, being for self is the wholly abstract limit of itself. Such being that is determinate and limited, but purely and immediately self-relating, and that has no internal moments, is called by Hegel the one. This one is not the one that being for self was immediately, and which contained being for one as its moment. Rather, it stands there by itself, without any internal differentiation, as purely and simply one. It is being for self as a single, limited, self-enclosed entity, as a being for self. Speculative logic shows, therefore, that being must take the form not only of being determinate, being something, and being finite, but also of being one. Indeed, being for self in the form of being one is the true fulfillment of qualitative being. It is being absolutely oneself without relation to anything else, without any internal multiplicity. Note that being one cannot be thought on the basis of the earlier categories of determinate being. Something is not explicitly a one just by virtue of being something, nor is anything one insofar as it is simply finite. Being one is a further form of being for self, and so consists in being infinitely self-relating. This is not to deny that every finite something is also one, but what it is to be one is a new category altogether that is quite different from being something or being finite. And then he goes on to talk about the one and the void, which I haven't gotten to, many ones and so on and so forth. So basically, what we've gotten to here is the limit of the manifold of categories that each relate to each other within Dasein, or within the early being for self, and come to a one that is wholly itself. It's crystallized into one homogeneous substance, right? As opposed to one with a manifold in it of related terms, without which related terms it collapses itself. It has reached its pinnacle. And only after reaching that pinnacle is its relation of one to many, I think, make it turn over into quantity by the nature. I mean, even hearing the terms, that seems to make sense. I'm going to stop there. Stack is open. So you're reading the Kaufman, Doug?
I finished it today. I've been reading it for months, but
Cool.
he's an interesting guy in the sense like he's like a complete distorter of Nietzsche, making him into this kind of liberal existentialist as opposed to like a reactionary proto-fascist. But his take on Hegel is actually much better. Like, he doesn't portray Hegel as a reactionary. He does kind of at times look at Hegel as this kind of existentialist figure, which whatever, but it's a lot more useful. And there's like a long appendix of like letters to and from and about Hegel, which was useful.
Nice.
He also did a little text, I think it's like commentary on Hegel. It's like basically a long translation of the preface to the Phenomenology with a bunch of notes on it, which I actually liked. And that's actually how I was able to read the preface, because I actually haven't read the Phenomenology in full.
Yeah, the preface is a lot of fun to read once you realize where he's going. And yeah, you're right. You really need a commentary. I used Yovell's.
And like I said, say what you want about Kaufman on Hegel, and he's not like my go-to guy, but I thought his commentary on the Phenomenology was good enough because I was able to get through it. It took a few weeks, even though that's like a fairly short text, but again, I thought it was decent. I am going to try and finish his book on Nietzsche. I've got about 100 pages left, which is I don't recommend it. It's not very good.
Well, I mean, it can't be any worse than what you just finished reading with the book on Marxism. That was terrible.
Oh, Kalikowski. Well, yeah. I mean, it's just 1,200 pages to conclude, but human nature. I read a fair amount of it when I wrote on Stalinism, but I didn't. There was like a lot I hadn't actually read. I'm like, yeah, I want to finish this cover to cover. Yeah, there's some like funny insults he levels at Adorno at times that I kind of chuckled at, but like when he's talking about stuff like I know about, it's like, oh God, it's like it's wrong. And it's like I already know where he's coming from. It's interesting though that he kind of takes a Lukashian approach to Marx. It's like Lukács got the right approach to Marx. He just doesn't like either of them that much.
I think he said that Lukács and Gramsci had the best approaches to Marx.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I mean, unless you like really want to torture yourself, his book is not really worth going into. I would just there's other commentaries that are better, and if you want to read a lot of those figures, it's just best to read them without his like obnoxious anti-communism. He's returning to Mother Church. It's basically he's returning to Catholicism, and obviously he sees like the free market as this natural thing.
It's so wild because it's so ironic because the Catholic Church, when the free market was coming on the scene, did not see it as natural at all. It saw it as
I mean, they had their own, like, what was it, Pope Leo the 13th, whatever the one, they had the encyclical at the end of the 19th century. And yeah, they kind of wanted to like tame some of the excesses of it. And, that you saw that with the rise of like Christian unions and Christian democracy. But ultimately, they side with the oppressors and the exploiters. I really think their rhetoric is generally empty, and really, they're against actually dealing with capitalism. And I think that's true of pretty much all organized religion, especially the Catholic Church. There's a reason they sided with Francisco Franco and Hitler and Mussolini.
I think there's a parallel with Zionism, because Zionism was originally a project to ease the burden of the Jew in Europe based on all the reactionary shit. But when it actually reached its consummation, I mean, it's almost like Hegel's phenomenology, freedom turned over and reversed into terror, as we're seeing today.
I mean, I think it's a little different because Hegel does see, when you're reading about, the terror in the French Revolution as a necessary stage, but it was, that gives way to, more realism, Napoleon and whatever. Whereas Zionism it really wasn't some necessary thing or a necessary stage. It was, I think, there may have been idealists, but pretty much it was accepted all the premises of anti-Semitism, and it basically it undercut any attempt at solidarity, and they understood all the leaders of Zionism that the land was not empty. They just thought the inhabitants there were not. It wasn't their land because it wasn't in their blood, their soul. Blood and soil nationalism, and they all, and like if you read Ben Gurion, like he was he's like the more left Zionist. He was very understandable. The Arabs are going to fight us. We want to expel them. There's no compromise on that. And it was a reactionary, retrograde project from the beginning. It's basically Jim Crow in the Middle East.
Yeah, if you read Herzl, go back to the father of political Zionism, Herzl, read the Jewish state, you see all kinds of reactionary ideas in that work. And the thing about Herzl was, before he became a Zionist, he was a journalist. He was sent to France by Austrian newspapers to report on the rising anti-Semitic movement in France. And Herzl went out of his way to befriend the leaders of that movement. And he actually admired, in his diaries, in his personal diaries, he admitted to admiring those people. And he admitted to being very much influenced by them. And you can see the influence. He accepted many of their basic premises. The idea that Jews and Gentiles cannot be expected to live together amicably as equals. Herzl says that's true. Can't.
Yep.
And he even says that anti-Semitism was a natural reaction to the Jewish emancipation. The idea being, when Jews were free to, enter the liberal professions, and so competing with Gentiles, it was only natural that Gentiles would resent that. And Herzl says he is sympathetic to the Gentiles on that. He says they're perfectly right to resent that. And he's offering them a solution to that. He believed it would work in the best interest of both groups.
It's also to relate this maybe tangentially to Hegel. Obviously, like Hegel's system is seen, it's a universal system. It's not particularist, and if you read like Hegel, like he likes the idea of the modern state, like constitutional, that it can realize freedom, etc. And if you look, and he says he says it in a number of places, but I believe he says in the Philosophy of Right, like all that is real is rational, but not all that's rational is real, something to that effect. And if you look at Zionism,
it's the real is rational and the rational is real.
Okay. And there's obviously different ways to read that. Sorry, I forgot the exact quote, but it could be saying as viewed as justifying the established order, or it could be saying like the established order is not rational and it needs to be made rational. And if you look at a particular idea like Zionism and Israeli apartheid, that's not rational. It's real, but it's not in line with reason, with the kind of modernity that Hegel was advocating. A state, that has like citizens and constitution, etc. Israel actually does not have a constitution. It has basic laws, but not a constitution.
I have questions about that, and I'm not in a position to know very much yet about Hegel's philosophy of history. But it seems to me like that judgments that take what reality has unfolded into as not having been what ought to have been is exactly what he argues against in his writing. In other words, a philosophy that remains mired in the ought, however he said it, at one point or another, is one that sorry, that's where the wheels come off the wagon. The interpretation, I think, is that because he says that reality unfolds necessarily in its logic, that the current state of things is justified morally and ethically. That's not what he's saying. In fact, he negates the moral or ethical judgment as such in his philosophy as one-sided and stuck in the ought. Things ought to be this way. Well, from which perspective? It remains purely subjective idealism, in other words. And so being able to account for the progress or the or even a regression into barbarism here or there, you have to be able to account for cause and effect of the you have to account for reality, in other words. And if you can't make what happens, how do I want to say this? Something bad happens, and you argue, as you wrote in your book, that it was just a bolt from the blue. It's completely unreasonable and not rational, and it has, no cause and no effect, and it's just sort of this isolated incident caused by nothing, the bolt from the blue. Then that's not something that can be captured by reason. Hegel's point in general is that everything in the universe can be captured by reason and understood, and moreover, universalized. In other words, reasoned through correctly. And the only way you're going to really understand it is if you do that. And so,
Sure. I mean,
I'm
like,
not,
everything can conceivably be understood. It has its rationality, and we can grasp it. We may not have the answers right away, but we are fully capable of coming to those answers.
Now Marx's project tries to substantiate the communist horizon, not on the idea that it ought to occur because it would be better for 99% of the humanity, but because scientifically it is necessitated by what capitalism builds itself. In other words, it builds its own working class. It builds conditions in which the intolerability of the government of 99% of us in the way that it does will turn over into, the overthrow. In other words, it has to rationally project its own end, which is going to happen, right? So Marx bases the communist horizon on reason, not on what ought to be, or, he has that whole several chapters in which he talks about the privations and the deaths of so many youths in the early capitalist organization in England, right? And we feel sad for those people, but that's not why he's writing Capital. He's writing Capital because, well, I mean, there's felt the moral necessity, but moral necessity is not going to get you there. What gets you there is being certain that capitalism is, by its structure, its rational structure, going to bury itself with what we want, which is our
right. I mean, this is the difference between utopian and scientific socialism.
right.
They mean well, the utopians. They've come up with these fantastic ideas, but there's no real agent to realize them. There's no material necessity. It's mostly a moral critique, and most of what they propose is, looking for some enlightened reformer or some enlightened ruler to help them out. And it's really something that could conceivably be done at any time, but there's no material necessity for it. Whereas Marx and Engels and people who follow them, including, I assume, all of us, that capitalism has inherent contradictions, that there's a material necessity of crisis and breakdown, and that the proletariat is the agent, the historical agent that can lead humanity out of the morass into communism.
Yeah. And when you're looking at an entity that has consummated itself like Zionism in Israel, I'm not sure where to fit that in the argument, because I think it fits into the irrationalist strain of philosophy.
It comes out of, it's a mirror image of anti-Semitism. And obviously, modern anti-Semites were very much opposed to reason and rationality. In fact, they saw the Jews as the carrier of reason and rationality, of universalism. And, it's also, if you're talking about Hegel, I mean, Hegel doesn't just view history as like, everything going up and up. He's very aware that there's a bad side and that there's a cunning of reason, and, that there are periods of regression. Marx recognized this too, so does Lenin. And it is something that comes out of like the era of imperialism. You probably couldn't have had Zionism in its modern form like 200 years before it originally, like in 1700.
And in that sense, you could say that Zionism was necessitated by what came before it, and its overthrow is necessitated by its actions, in consummating itself right now. Like right now, this is intolerable. But projecting how it's going to be overthrown, I couldn't begin to get into like the mechanism for how the mechanism for overthrow, as far as I've been able to tell in the Marxist context, is bloody. Marx says it's civil war. Civil war precipitates revolution in general, and you can't avoid that. The Black Hundreds had to precede the revolutions of 1905 and 1917 because, in part, they motivated and necessitated other bodies to get involved in taking over governance where the czar utterly failed in turning to the Black Hundreds and other things like that. Does that about track?
Yeah, it seems to.
Okay. Um, I wanted to talk about a little bit about the proletariat and how it needs to go from a state of Dasein to being for self. But after getting through the early part of being for self, in which being for self is not even being for self immediately, I'm Marx's appropriation of Hegel's categories as analogs. Hegel himself uses analogs, but they're very loose because these are moving determinations that disappear in and of themselves, in their being themselves, and relating the proletariat to a being for self. I mean, that's what Marx does and Engels does. The proletariat has to go to a point of self-consciousness. But that's where I think I'm not going to say the relation breaks down there, because it's probably more complex than I know, because I'm not familiar with the material. I don't know. Does anyone have thoughts on that?
I mean, the proletariat being self-conscious. I mean, I think there are different levels to it. Gramsci kind of goes into like the economic, corporate, hegemonic, and etc. It's like you can obviously have workers who understand their workers. In that sense, I guess they're class conscious. They may be class conscious and seeing like they want to fight for the interests of all workers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they want to overthrow class society. Because you obviously have people in social democratic parties who are workers and understand their workers, and they fight for that. They're very constrained. And obviously you can have even a lower level. It's like, I'm a worker, but I'm looking out for my trade, whether it's like boiler makers or whatever. Or I'm a skilled worker and I'm just looking out for that. Or you can have it at a much different level. Like, I'm a worker and I'm fighting for the abolition of class society. I'm Lenin's tribune of the people. I'm fighting for hegemony, fighting against all the oppression and exploitation. So it's like, it's not like I'm not quite sure how to relate it to Hegel in this sense, but I think there are gradations in like consciousness and being for it yourself. I know Marx is talking about like the most class conscious, wanting to get rid of class society.
Yeah. Yeah.
London used the term trade union consciousness to describe the lesser forms of class consciousness. You're looking out for your trade, or you might be trying to improve, just consider improving the position of workers within capitalist society. We're not trying to overthrow it.
Anyone catch my long thread on Heinrich versus uh, Fred Mosley? No, that's okay. Well, the long and the short of it is, um, well, the long and the short of it is Heinrich is trying to delete the quantitative aspects from the commodity in its makeup and say that value cannot exist at all until it's realized. But what contradicts that is that you have to have certain measurements in place in order to calculate what the realization is when it shows up. Right? Anyway, that's a capital thing.
Oh, there's been long been debates over the relationships between value and prices. In bourgeois economists argue that you should only be concerned about prices. They talk about value in the sense of the classical political economists, or in the sense of Marx, is meaningless. And Marxists have been debating what about the relationship between value and price for 150 years or so. We had a whole transformation debates over the so-called transformation problem.
The one thing that keeps coming back to me about that argument, and then I'll wrap it up on that point, is that Marx is describing a whole process. He's not describing discrete processes that are unconnected. Okay. What Heinrich wants to do, it sounds like, is delete one or more of the moments within the manifold of the whole process. The problem with that is that if you do that, the result you're looking for in realization disappears too. Right? The moments in the capitalist process, specifically the production process, lead to the realization in the form that we get, right? In other words, profits. And then the question becomes, where do profits come from? And every time I've asked a follower of Heinrich, they give me a mystical answer. Oh, well, it just shows up. It self concretizes. Like I've heard several like different versions of this, but basically it boils down to it just magically shows up. And then I try to say, okay, from where? And they say, well, in places other than the production process. It's not actually the production process, it's the exchange process, it's the circulation. And so I say, okay, where? Is it the movement of the commodities after the production process? Is it in the marketplace? Right? Is it the gathering the materials for the production process? Because those are the stakes. Those are the other points of the circuit. And the big hole in Heinrich's argument to me is that Marx, in the whole of the three volumes of Capital, systematically goes through the entire circuit outside of the production processes and says, is any surplus value accumulated here? Let's take a look. And he does the math. And he says, if anything, outside of the production process, it's almost overwhelmingly a negative sign. In other words, we lose money moving it, distributing it, consuming it. There's no addition, only subtraction. So how can you say that there's an input in the circulation process? Well, Heinrich's followers say there is, but they neglect to show us the math. And so it's kind of a dead letter. But you can't tell people who primarily rely on Heinrich to read Capital rather than reading Capital themselves, right? Doug, you and me and others, we read Capital for ourselves with a guide, but one that mostly was faithful to Marx. I don't think these people are taking at least that minimal faithfulness to Marx to at least say, here's the base argument. They're saying the guide tells me that, Marx isn't wrong, but Heinrich is right. And when I try to emphasize that, okay, so he's saying Marx is wrong, they say, no, Marx isn't wrong. And I say, yeah, but what about these variables? Oh, well, that's not where the value comes from. But it remains an assertion.
I mean, he's opposed to, Marxism as a worldview, the declining rate of profit, all these kind of very essential things in Capital. And I'm just, I don't find that a very valuable guide to Capital. He's welcome to obviously have his own views, and okay, but Marx did say that the falling rate of profit was like the most fundamental law. And the way a lot of Heinrich on Capital comes off that like he's found some kind of like esoteric wisdom that no one else has kind of figured out. And
it's
if you want to base your system off that, okay, but I don't think it's Marx. I mean, the guide that I think we were both using, which I do recommend, was Joseph Chinora, if I hope I'm pronouncing his name. I mean, he's basically was just trying to explain the chapters in Capital. He really didn't deviate too much from that, which was helpful for Capital. Even though I had read it before, it was still like a very helpful guide, kind of pointing out things and everything. And again, I thought it was very faithful, but yeah. I mean, Heinrich is also writing his own biography of Marx. I've read the first volume, but it's like hard to give you like an idea of it because he stops like even before like the economic and philosophical manuscript. He goes up to like 1841 or something. It's just like Marx isn't even the young Marx at that point.
Yeah. And
but that might be a side point, but yeah, he's not, as far as I can tell, like Heinrich is not big on Hegel and dialectics. Which, I know that there are so-called schools of Marxism that reject that. I just don't know how they're Marxist.
The thing that worries me about latter-day Marxists following Heinrich is they're not even necessarily only negating dialectics from Marxism or Marx's work, but the very economic insights that he came up with in the first place that negated the original political economists. On my reading, and I haven't read him in full, but on my reading so far, at least by the summaries, he's regressing Marxism to a position aligned with, Smith and Ricardo on some points, erasing the measurement of value, socially necessary labor time, for instance, that counts up the hours of labor that go into the production process. If that's not where value comes from, and that's his argument, I mean, that's the bread and butter. What do you like?
Interesting. He's like actually behind like a lot of anarchists. So there, as far as I can tell, I mean, unless you want to count Proudhon, but there's really not much in terms of like anarchist political economy of capitalism. Like Bakunin actually translated Capital into Russian. And, a lot of them look to that. The thing is, they're like, oh, Marx got a lot of the economics right. We just don't like the politics, like the dictatorship of the proletariat and that. Which, okay, that's kind of stupid, but at least, we can have a discussion on the political economy of it. Whereas with Heinrich, it isn't even up to that level. Which is, just kind of an interesting observation.
Yeah. So we've got about 9 minutes, but kind of circling back to the text. So we've been going into being for self, and the next section is B, the one and the many. And it's going to go through with a few remarks on Leibniz and his monads. Um, I could say, well, let's put it this way. We're taking off Monday, right? What if I said that we read from 164 to 184, and that's the end of chapter 3? And that way we have basically double the reading, and we go from the one and the many to quantity. A lot of this is actually remarks on Kantian construction of matter, Leibniz's monads, so they're topical, right? The actual logical sections are really quite short and go from the one and the void, talks about atomism, which philosophically some of us may be familiar with already. Then we go to repulsion and attraction, which talks about the exclusion of the one of attraction. I'm really eager to get into the description of this movement of repulsion and attraction, because it's the next stage in which we go from this state of being one into the next transition point, which is the movement of repulsion and attraction. And that transition point dumps us out into quantity. So I don't think it's that much to ask us just to read to the end of the chapter in 2 weeks and then reconvene when? On the 4th? Yeah, on the 4th, being ready to discuss basically, the point at which this dumps out into quantity. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that sounds good. I'm finding that my method is to read the text first, even if I don't understand a word of what he's saying. And we're getting into sections where I don't at all understand it. And once I read it a couple times, like finite and infinite, and the movement that it created, the double movement back and forth, that's determinate. It's hard to picture, but then I read the commentary and I see that it's like this moving manifold sublated into this new thing that's distinct in itself, which is what was it, Kyle? Being for self, I guess. Is that what it was?
What? Sorry.
Infinite and infinity and finiteness.
Yeah.
Their double oscillation became being for self, right?
Right. Yeah. Kind of true infinity kind of had finite as a moment of itself, but
and reintroduced a limit, which made it finite as opposed to infinite.
So the true infinity as such had just finite as its moment, but when true infinity became a form of being under being for self, that finite
self-relating, that's self-relating.
Self-relating being, then that means the finite moment itself became determinate being.
Yeah. And then the finite moments in that manifold are ones that are basically like, here's one moment of finite being, here's the next one, here's the next one, but you're still the same person or the same rock or the same whatever you are. They can be described as determinate, as finite, but also still here along I'm not going to say time because we're not at time, we're not at space, and we can't talk about those yet. And it turns out that is part of what makes being what it even at this level what it is. But these are the underdetermined categories before nature. It's funny because you don't really realize it, but when you get to the end, you realize that Hegel knows that nature determines these lower determinations to be what they are, but we cannot predicate those lower determinations on the higher ones. They can only be predicated on the lower ones, right? That's why when you start at sheer being, it does have a presupposition, but it's one that we abstract from in order to, in order to build a set of relations of the categories such that they're not they're not taken for granted, I guess you could say. Cool. Does anyone have any other thoughts? I've completely lost my voice. It's gone. Was it worth it? Yes, it was, I think. All right, guys. I will see you in 2 weeks, but let's keep the conversation going because it is a full 20 pages. I'll write out a couple of thoughts as I come to them on some of the remarks where he talks about Leibniz and Kant and what was the other one? Atomism, so that when we get here, we're already pretty familiar with those and can talk more about the logical movement as opposed to what we already talked about. Sound good? All right. You guys have a great night and happy Thanksgiving if you celebrate. If not, enjoy time with your families. I'm sure you'll have something going.
You too.
Take care.